This is A Drink with a Friend. I'm Tsh Oxenreider.
And I'm Seth Haynes.
Seth, what are you drinking?
Well, I'm double fisting today. Is that exciting or what?
Thrilling.
I'm drinking out of one mug, Starbucks, Keurig Starbucks. Because as I told you earlier, I've been derailed. I haven't really had a lot of time. I did go downstairs to Hellfellow Wellmat and had literally the best salad in all of Northwest Arkansas, for which they should win a James Beard Award. It's that good.
Wow. All right.
But I did not come back up with any coffee. So I'm drinking Starbucks from the Keurig. And I have another mug that is full of community coffee from home. It's one of those like thermos, thermos mugs that keeps it hot.
Yep.
So I'm going to be drinking from both over the course of this episode. And by the end, I'll have a definitive pick on which is better.
So it's been that kind of week, huh?
It's been
coffee.
Stupid. It's double fisting coffee is that kind. That's the week. It's the week of double fisting coffee. So,
I get it, man.
Anyway, thus it is. What are you drinking?
I am drinking what I call Foxy tea. I drink it every year around this time from Trader Joe's. I think it's called Fall Harvest, Autumn Harvest, something. I forget. You would think I know the name because we have like 20 boxes at home because it is a seasonal drink at Trader Joe's and I buy like all of it right now. And I only drink it now because it makes me feel like I'm in the fall. And so here in Texas, I am willing it to come. So I'm just it's my denial tea. It's my tea of denial. Because
that makes sense.
It doesn't feel like fall yet, but it kind of wants to be. And so I'm just helping it push it along. So
is this the time of year where you're like, oh man, why did we ever leave Oregon?
You know what? It's more like in September. We're starting to head into the month where I'm glad we live here. Only because when I hear from people in Oregon, they're already complaining about the cold. So I like a nice, long, slow fall, winter. And Texas definitely has that, because it takes its sweet time, to get here. And then when it does, it's nice and mild. So to me,
I like it.
I regret it more in August, September.
All right.
But yeah.
Well, I won't tell Portland that you said so, or Oregon that you said so.
Oh, trust me. I was going to say, I want to be anywhere but Portland right now. It's kind of a hot mess of a city. But Bend, where I lived, is gorgeous, like the trees and the leaves.
I've often heard this about Bend, and I would like to visit there one day. Maybe I will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's stunning. All right, so Seth, we kind of have this ongoing series we're going to do because I think for both of us, this topic takes like 12 parts at least, maybe a lifetime of it. I shared a few episodes ago my journey to the Catholic Church, and I want you to take some time maybe to unpack that beast and talk to us a bit. So I'm curious, like what's your starting point on explaining why you made the journey you did? And like, do you do things now like worship Mary and, all the stereotypes of what people assume we do? Like, let's just talk about it, man.
I worship Mary every day. No, I don't. That's hilarious. I still love that. I still think that's hilarious. I think for me, my story goes back to when I was a kid, actually. So we lived in a small town in Arkansas, kind of at the foothills of the Ozarks. And my parents weren't particularly pleased with the educational system in said small town. And so they moved us, my sister, me, they moved us to a small Catholic school when I was in fourth grade. And it was a Catholic school in Fort Smith, Arkansas, which was about 20 minutes away, 30 minutes. We would later move there. That's where I predominantly grew up. But we started, with this little commute to this Catholic school. Now, I was very, very Baptist, even as a kid, even as a young kid, I was very Baptist. And so you can imagine I had zero frame of reference for what it meant to be Catholic. Now, I will say my grandparents on my mom's side were Episcopalian, so I understood vaguely that there was such a thing as liturgy, which I thought was kind of weird, but I don't know, I only experienced it once a year and I was only 10 or whatever. So it's not like, I'd only experienced it really like 5 or 6 times my entire life. So it wasn't like a huge deal. So I was pretty uninitiated into liturgy. And so I went to a Catholic school, 4th grade for the first time. I still remember the responsorial psalm of my first mass of my life.
That's impressive.
So what happened is we sort of walk in to class like after recess, right? It's right before, we're going to go into the church building. And she says to us, we have the response today. And the response is, I believe that I shall see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living, which, as you know, is taken from the Psalms. And so we had to say it several times. And then we walked over across the street. We walked into the church building. And before we started Mass, the priest again, helped us learn and recite, I believe I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. And so it just kind of stuck with me my whole life. So anyway, that was my first experience with the Mass. And I'll tell you, it was so bizarre to me. Everything about it was bizarre because, everyone seemed to know what they were doing except me.
Right.
We walked in, people were putting their fingers in a little pool of water and crossing themselves and single filing into their respective pew and kneeling down in prayer. And there were all these statues around. And yeah, it was a really weird moment for me. But during that moment, Sister Sarto, who was Irish, and in my mind, Sister Sarto was about 92 years old. But I've seen her since, and she was probably 40.
I was just about to say she was 40. Probably 40.
Yeah. I thought she was ancient, but she was,
of course,
younger than I am now,
Right.
And she was really funny because she knew I wasn't Catholic. And so she reminded me no less than 3,000 times going over to the church that I wasn't supposed to take the Eucharist.
Right.
And I think the reason that she reminded me 3,000 times was because I didn't know what she was talking about. I was like, what are you talking about? So she finally explained it to me. And then she kind of said, but during the passing of the peace, this is you, this is for you. And so during the passing of the peace, I just remember looking around the room and seeing all these kids reach out and say peace to me, even though I didn't know any of them. It was my first day of school. I didn't know what I was doing. It was my first time in Mass. And there was just something about that moment that was really serene. And I think that's the first time that something hooked me in the Catholic Church.
Do you think it was the ritual of it or the tangibleness of it, that it was you had the physical stuff to do? I mean, what was it, do you think?
I don't know. I've always been kind of a head-driven person.
Right.
I've always lived a lot in my head. And this is not a new adult thing. It's not like an Enneagram party trick, I live in my head
right.
or whatever. I might have been that way since I was a kid. And so there was something about the experience that made space to think and to contemplate and to listen and to pass peace and, I don't know, just to be.
Yeah.
That was very, very different than the church I grew up in, which, again, this is no shade at the church I grew up in. I very much loved it. And I learned a lot from it, growing up Baptist. But, when you go into the Baptist church, it's loud organs the whole time. And when it's not that, it's a preacher at the front sort of being quasi-demonstrative. Some might even say yelling. When you go to your youth group or whatever, it's sword drills and, just constant activity. And I think there was something about the stillness of, the 10 minutes before Mass and even the stillness in slowness in the prayers that really led me to think, this is different. And I kind of like it.
I think I told you this a while ago, but one of the first times I went to Mass, I thought the mics were broken because the priest was just sitting there after his homily. And I was like, what's the deal? Why are we just sitting here? And then I realized, that's the point.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is the point. That is the point. And isn't it funny? I mean, even still today, I don't know if you still experience this, but those moments when, the priest, gives his homily and then he walks across and then sits down in the chair that's across the stage So there's this like, several seconds of him walking across the stage, and then he sits down, and there's these several seconds of quiet. And often it's not until that moment of quiet, that 20 seconds or whatever, that I kind of, I kind of like breathe out and realize, oh wait, this is the point.
Yeah. So, yeah. And what you said too, I think was really interesting in my experience as well, because it's both like the Catholic Mass is both fully participatory. Like we don't just sit there and watch other people use their gifts, right? We were invited. Well, we participate. We embody the service itself. However, at the same time, there's the paradox of, and yet it doesn't matter that we're there. Like it's not about us at all. We could be there or not be there, and this would still happen. And that felt very different to me coming from an evangelical background as well. Like it wasn't about me in the slightest.
No, it's not about you. In fact, and this is a little bit of a side point, but it's a really funny side point. When I was in my adult years, I had a really good friend. His name was Kylie. Kylie's an amazing individual, and he was at the time contemplating becoming Catholic, which he did not do. But he was contemplating becoming Catholic, and every year, Kylie and I, and it was like since college, when we were back home for Christmas, every year we would connect and we would see if we wanted to go to midnight mass, because I just really loved midnight mass, even though I was still very Baptist. And we would go to midnight mass together. And in one year, well into our adult years, I was probably in my 20s. We went to midnight mass. We ran into my old German teacher, who was named Mr. Lear. Mm-hmm. Kylie was talking to Mr. Lear, and he was telling him, I'm thinking about becoming Catholic. And Mr. Lear sort of laughed, that sort of knowing German laugh, and said, well, why would you do a thing like that, Kylie? And Kylie said, I've been evangelical my whole life, and I've always had opinions, and I've always had, avenues to express my opinion. And every time I've been in a church, people seem to generally like want to hear my opinions. But then when I share them, there's this illusion that they're going to do something about it, but they never do. And he's like, what I love about Catholicism is I have all these opinions, and it ain't going to change. It's been this way for 2,000 years. My opinions mean nothing. And that's very freeing to me. And we just both started laughing. But the truth is, that's the truth. It's kind of freeing. It's really freeing, for sure. And so, but I'm sure you're not like thinking these things, right? Were you a teenager at that time? No. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I started I was fourth grade, and then went all the way through Catholic school my ninth grade year. We did not have a Catholic school in high school. So starting my ninth grade year, I was back to the old Baptist church, but my dad became Catholic when I was in fifth grade, I think. I did not know that. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So for a while, I kind of actually thought that he did it for the tuition break, because super convenient to become Catholics and just pay a few $100 a month less for your kids. Right. But, as I've matured and gotten older and become hopefully less cynical, and watched him practice his life, like he's a true believer. Okay. All right. So you saw your dad, not your mom. So you kind of grew up with a little bit of a lot of traditions and practices, or what? Oh yeah. So that's a huge part of my story. So I actually became, the way I've put it before is I was a little bit of a spiritual mutt. So I was actually, I was very, very Baptist, but my grandparents were Episcopalian. As I grew older, I started to learn more what that meant and became enamored with, and really, came to love and appreciate that tradition. My grandparents on the other side were Church of Christ. I would be not telling you the truth to say that I became enamored with that tradition. I did not. But I was Baptist. My dad was Catholic. And then when I graduated from high school, we went to a Church of Christ school, which is kind of a long story that involves murder and drugs and a trust fund that was given to the school, which allowed me to end up going there. True story, but I won't go into all the details right now. That sounds like an episode of some like crime show. It is. It totally is. And one day I'll tell it, and you will say that can't be true, but it's totally true. So I end up at this Church of Christ school, and that's where things started to get really weird, because I'd had all this Catholic experience, and here I am in my Bible classes, and the professor at the front of the room is saying these things about the Catholic Church that are like patently untrue, right? Like I was taught very early on in my Catholic studies that, the prayers to Mary, it's not worshiping Mary. It's literally asking your mom to pray for you,
Right.
Praying with the saints is literally like asking the saints to pray for you. Just like I might say, Tish, I'm having a really bad day at work. Would you pray for me? It's kind of the same idea, right? And they would say all these things about worshiping the saints and worshiping Mary. And I would say, no, that's not true. And then they would attack me for being Baptist and being like, well, you're Baptist. Why should we? So then now I'm defending the Baptist church. Right. And so, so there were always these weird moments where I was like really struggling with, defending the Catholics or defending Episcopalians or defending the Baptists at this Church of Christ school. And it became really apparent to me that like, wow, like this idea of unity that Jesus preached, we're a long way from that.
Right.
And I began to see sort of the way I would put it is I began to see that like pretty much we all have our own popes, right? Like we can say we don't. And in the Church of Christ, they're like supposed to be non-centralized. But there are figures even within the Church of Christ who set sort of the doctrinal direction of the church, even though they would argue with me that they do not. They do.
Well, Kyle and I will say usually in the non-denominational setting, you're your own pope. So in that way, everyone really does have their own pope. Yeah.
Yeah. And it goes back to Kylie's point, right? Like you have your own opinions and you express your own opinions and live by your own opinions.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. So I graduated. I graduated from college with this sort of like unsettling, thought in the back of my mind, and I became a Baptist youth minister. And I was a Baptist youth minister for a year. I told them I did not know if I was called to be a pastor or a youth pastor. I was an associate. I did the music and the creative arts kind of stuff, and the youth pastor said essentially, hey man, just come on in here and just see. And after about a year of that in Tulsa, I knew, yep, this ain't my bag. This is not for me. So Amber and I left. I went to law school, and for the next long period of time, 20-ish years, I led worship in evangelical, non-denominational churches, and in one particular, in Fayetteville, Arkansas.
Okay. That's a long time of just kind of letting that simmer, that idea of church and unity and liturgy and what does that have to do with anything? Kind of to let that percolate. Were you thinking all along the way, or were you just kind of pushing it out of your mind?
I mean, I thought about it all along. I've always thought deeply and hard about church unity. It's always been a struggle of mine.
Yeah.
I've also always remembered the Catholic Church of my youth very fondly. And some did not, some my age, I'm in my early 40s or mid 40s. Some people my age, had very terrible experiences in the Catholic Church, but I didn't, partly because I was an outsider, right? So I got to experience from the outside. So I always had just sort of a fondness for it. And then I started finding that in my 30s, and this was before my sobriety experience, I found in my 30s that like everyone I was reading that I really, really loved was Catholic.
Right.
And that's when I was like, wait a second, I think maybe these people are speaking my language.
Yeah. Was there a point, I'm not trying to like put my story on yours, I'm just curious because this is what happened to me in that like simmering period when I kind of realized that in my Protestant upbringing, there was like 1,500 years of history and thinkers that I didn't know about. It was like we talked about Jesus and Acts, and then we jumped to Martin Luther. Did any of that come into play, like the old thinkers, or was this all new people?
Not really. I mean,
okay.
I definitely read the old thinkers, but I mean, I loved Chesterton. I loved the Confessions, although, as we discussed, I haven't read that now in 20 years. I loved Tolkien. I love these Catholic writers and Catholic thinkers, but I also loved a lot of non-Catholic writers and thinkers too, right? Like I certainly read a lot of people who were religious and yet not Catholic. And it never really dawned on me, the logic of it. I'm a very logical thinker, but I'm also I'm a deep feeler. I'm a very emotional person. And so the logic of, well, I've only been reading 200 years worth of theology from, white evangelical dudes. That never really dawned on me because that wasn't really the argument that compelled me.
Okay.
Anyway.
Okay.
And so I think a lot of that's one of the beauties of, I think, I'm going to say the church, like capital C church. And by that, I mean, like, I'm expressing this beyond the Catholic Church. I think that's one of the beauties of the Christian faith, the church, the Christian faith, is that there really is room to appeal to those who are very logically motivated. And there's room to appeal to those who are very deep feelers and emotionally motivated. Mm-hmm. And the goal and the hope is that those who are geared one way, as they come into a deeper expression faith, they build, right? If you're logically motivated and geared, you build the emotional connection and vice versa.
Yeah.
So I would say this like sort of logical path of like, well, I had only really read 200 years worth of theology. That was actually probably a bigger deal to me post becoming Catholic than pre.
Okay. That's interesting. I think for me, it was the other way around. So, I mean, and you're exactly right. I think there are many paths to Rome. And kind of speaking of, I think one thing for me was this idea. I thought of the Catholic Church as another denomination, and it didn't hit me. I mean, I would always think about, gosh, Jesus talks a lot about unity, and we didn't do a very good job of this. But I think whenever I had a former Anglican priest turned Catholic explain that the Catholic Church isn't another denomination, it was like the church, and then we created all these denominations. When I first really started talking with you about all of this, it was back in 2014 in Italy, and you were wrestling like crazy. I wasn't yet. Mm-hmm. You were wrestling like crazy. Like, what brought you to that? Was it this idea of unity? Was it something else altogether?
Well, that was right after, as you'll recall, that was right after I got sober. It was right after I quit drinking.
That's right.
And so that's actually the crux of my story.
Okay.
So I quit drinking in 2013, September of 2013, and didn't touch alcohol at all, not a drop, for over 5 years. And so in that season that we were talking, it was very much in that early span of not drinking, of being sober. And I will say, just as a caveat and aside, I have now not been drunk for almost 10 years, which is, it's unfathomable, but kind of awesome also at the same time.
It's a big deal.
So, it's a huge deal. And a lot of that comes from, my journey into the Catholic faith. And so what happened was I quit drinking, and it was a very dramatic moment. I tell all about it in my first book, Coming Clean. I write some about it in the book of Waking Up, which is the second book. And there is one definitive moment where I made a shift. And this I actually write about this very clearly in the book of Waking Up. And I went to a friend's house. There was a preacher from Portland who had come down. He's a dear friend of mine, still a dear friend of mine. He is from this sort of Foursquare denomination, which is like this sort of Pentecostal-ish light denomination. Yeah. One of the best men I know. His name is Greg. And Greg came down because they were looking at setting up sort of a monastic community for college students, or a monastic experience for college students with an agrarian component, which they wanted to set up in Arkansas. So we sort of met together and we had this brainstorming night. And at the end of the night, my friend John Ray was there. And if you read my writing, you know John. He's an amazing individual. And he looked at the table and he was like, well, there's bread here and there's wine here. Let's take the Lord's Supper. So Amber starts passing around. She's like serving the elements, and she's to my right. So she has to go all the way around the circle before she gets back to me. And there was this sort of moment where everybody, like, it dawned on them, oh no, Seth hasn't had anything to drink since September, and it's March now, so several months, and we're about to offer him wine. What's going to happen here?
Mm-hmm.
And I had remembered this moment that my grandma had said to me, if my sobriety can't withstand communion, then it's not actual sobriety.
Oh,
right? She herself had been an alcoholic, and she had, gone through the Episcopalian Church and had taken communion wine for years, and that was kind of her mantra. And so as it came around to me, I thought, okay, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tear off the bread. I'm going to intinct it. I'm going to eat it. And I did. And when I did that, I had a very, very, very visceral experience. And that very visceral experience was that I was literally eating something that tasted like flesh and blood. And I can't explain it to you. I know it doesn't make any sense. It wasn't consecrated by a priest. So, listen, God's grace is big enough for this moment.
Right.
For the Catholic listeners out there and for the Protestant listeners out there, I know this sounds insane, but it's what happened.
It sounds insane to both parties. Yeah.
Yeah. This is truly, truly crazy shit. I get it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I just break down there and we leave, and I tell Amber what happened. I can barely get it out. And I'm like, I don't know what just happened, but I have to figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
So pretty shortly thereafter, we pick up a copy of Alexander Schmeemann's For the Life of the World, which is he's an Orthodox writer.
Right.
We start reading this together, and we read the chapter on the Eucharist, the historicity of it, the experience of it, all the things. And as I'm reading it, I'm like, holy crap, this is what happened. We have to find a place to celebrate this. We have to find a place to do this. And oddly, what I did not know was at the same time, Amber was really wrestling through, the historical origins of the church.
Yeah.
And somebody had sent her a link to Father Groeschel, who is this old monk, and so she is listening to this one day, and she breaks down on the floor and she starts crying and begging and saying, "Please, God, don't make me become Catholic. I don't want to do this."
I think we all have that prayer at some point. Yeah.
Yeah, at some point that definitely happens for everyone who is not born into the Catholic Church, right? And
That's
so
right.
she has this moment, and then I'm having this, kind of parallel experience. And so what we decided, because obviously I couldn't go take communion immediately, right, at the Catholic Church. So what we decided was that, well, certainly the Anglican Church is just as good, right? It's like the path. It's a similar path. They take the Eucharist very seriously. And so we made our way to this Anglican church. It had just opened. Mm-hmm. We went there one Sunday, and we, our family of 6 doubled the size of the church overnight. And so for a series of years, that's where we went to really explore the theology of the Eucharist.
It's so interesting how many convert stories involve the Anglican Church. And I think the appeal is that via media, the middle way. Yeah. It's this idea of I can still be Protestant, but take the Eucharist seriously and take liturgy seriously. And that's not to throw Anglicanism under the bus. It was a huge part of my formation as well. So it's just interesting to me how often that's the path. Okay, so you're in the Anglican Church, and that was good for a while until it wasn't. So I know there's all sorts of things that you don't want to get into, but I'm curious, what did you ever feel at home there, or was it always a bit of an itch of this is almost not quite?
I mean, yeah. So it's really funny. It's really funny. I have a good friend. First of all, several of my closest friends still go to that church, and we are very, very dear friends. In fact, one's a business partner of mine. Mm-hmm. So I throw zero shade at this church. Mm-hmm. There was a priest there. He was actually just an assisting priest. His name is Paul. Paul's hilarious. And Paul is still Anglican, still an Anglican priest to this day. But we would talk all the time, and we would start. And he's very Anglo-Catholic, so his all his albs have Mary on them, and he prays the Rosary regularly, and he has a little altar set up his house where he prays his Rosary, and he just a trip. And the more and more we would talk, the more I'd be like, yeah, this is kind of how I feel, but I actually feel more Catholic about it than I do Anglican. But this is kind of a place where Amber and I can sort of reach this middle ground. And so we'd have all these funny conversations about like, would I actually become Catholic if given the opportunity? And so I think for me, I was always a little bit unsettled, but also like it was kind of what I knew, right? I led worship there. I played guitar and it was a place where I could do that. And I thought that would not be possible at the Catholic Church. So it seemed like a good middle ground, but the long story short that I can tell, there's a lot more to this story that maybe we'll unpack later, or maybe Amber will, but Amber went into a curacy at that church. So she was supposed to be a curate, and on her way to ordination. She was in seminary, and as she went into that process, she began to feel more and more uncomfortable with the priest who had been called into into the service of the church. And there were a variety of reasons for that. But over time, as she expressed those things just got really disordered emotionally. And it wasn't just between them, it was him and many people in the church. And it got to be sicker and sicker and just not good, to the extent that she was like, golly, this is so hard. Like, maybe I'll just stick it out. And like, maybe that's my crown and glory, is that I stuck it out through this ordination process. Well, at this point, I'm seeing enough behind the curtain, because she's in the ordination process. And it's not just the curtain of her ministry. It's really behind the curtain of like all of it, of the stuff. And I finally go to her and I'm like, listen, I don't think I can do this. I really want to explore becoming Catholic. If that's okay with you, I'll still attend church with you on Sundays, and, I'll go to mass, and then, make sure that I'm here for your ministry and whatever. But like, if you want to serve here with that particular priest, go for it. But like, I can't be under his care, because it's not care. And she said that was fine. Blessed me to go. Knew that I had been thinking about it for a long time anyway. I mean, well before this priest came into the picture, and probably well before that Eucharistic experience that I had. And so she blessed me. We talked with the community, including that priest, and they were all like, yeah, man, go explore, go do this thing. So I left, and I still attended on Sunday, still had worship, but I began to explore the Catholic Church and entered RCIA, which is the Rite of Christian Initiation. I don't know what is the A for?
For adults.
Academy? I don't know. It's
for adults.
Association?
Okay, no, it's for adults, because they have a children's version as well, And so this is like
RCIC.
Yep. So RCIA is for adults. Okay.
I guess if I would have thought that through, I thought I could have figured that out, but who knows anyway. So I started going through RCIA, and that was the beginning of the process of me coming into the church, though there would be a hard pause on it.
Yeah. And there's a lot of stuff that happens. And I get that. I mean, like we said, this will be a mini part series, because we can't we can't explain it in 35 minutes or so.
That's right.
I think it's interesting to me. I remember a moment, I want to say it was like 2019 fall, maybe. I think it was right before COVID. You and I were texting, and you said something about like, hey, I think we're going to become Catholic. And I said something about like, I can't stop thinking about it as well. And I said, I feel like I'm Catholic in how in my brain and in my body, I'm just having to like, I don't remember how I worded it, but basically have to go on Sunday to this other place. But otherwise, like everything in me is in agreement with this. It's just like that weird in between stage, almost like a purgatory. So maybe that's a good place to park, because I think there's a lot more to unpack. But I don't know, like, if you're put yourself in the shoes of a listener right now who's like, this is weird. I've had somewhat of a similar nudge, but I don't know what to do with it. What would you like tell this person?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would tell them what my priest told me at the end of my RCIA experience. So when we got to the end of my RCIA experience, I had a very particular question about Amber and her ministry. And I went to him and I said, yada, yada, she's going to continue in ministry. can I go there and not participate in the Eucharist there? And, it was just this big question of like, what would I do if I were under your care? And he said he's probably totally wrong. He probably shouldn't have said this, but he did. But it was the single best piece of pastoral advice I've ever been given. And
Wow.
He said, listen, there are some things that are more important than becoming Catholic. And one of those things is being committed to your first sacrament, which is the sacrament of marriage. Like that's your highest commitment right now. And he said, I will tell you that over and over again, I have told people to pause and to pray and to be diligent and see what happens. Something might happen that changes the calculus. And as we can talk about in a later edition, that's exactly what happened. Things happened, the calculus changed. And a year later, Amber would say, yeah, I'm ready to enter RCIA and become Catholic. So I think the first thing that I would tell people is, like, this is not a decision that you have to make rashly, hastily, or even in the next year or 2 years. And I know, like, we don't know when we're going to die and when the next day is and all those things. Like, listen, I think there's enough grace for sure. If you were to walk out and get hit by a bus tomorrow, and you were like, oh, I thought I was going to be Catholic and now I'm dead. Whatever. There's grace for all that stuff, right? Whatever.
Yeah.
So I would say, first of all, like, the first piece of advice I would give someone is just go slow down, man. Think about it, pray about it, feel it out, talk to the people that you're committed to, like whether that's your spouse or your kids or whatever, like have those conversations. And I'd also say, like, keep studying, keep reading, keep learning, keep doing the things that brought you to the door in the first place. And then I think the last thing I would say is, like, identify whether what's keeping you from making any commitment to faith, first and foremost, any commitment to faith, any commitment to Christianity, any commitment, to God, then to Christianity, then to the Catholic Church, like wherever you are, ask yourself, am I there logically, but I can't get there emotionally? And if that's true, start to unpack why that's true. If you say, I'm there emotionally, but I can't get there logically, ask yourself why that's true and start to unpack that and start to work on that aspect. Like, find what are the areas that are hanging you up and then do the work in those areas to see if there's something stopping you that's really just like a thing you need to let go of.
That is some really good wisdom there. I think that's exactly what I would say as well, but I wouldn't have said it like that. And I think you put language to things that are so true, because I think you're right that sometimes we kind of, like, I picture, a pubescent boy whose feet are bigger than his body. Like, that's kind of our process sometimes. And I was there logically, but I had a lot of emotional baggage of, like, what it meant to be Catholic and what it would mean for me socially and relationally and all that. And I had a lot of unpacking for that more than the logic. And I could see how someone else, it would be the opposite or some other situation. But I love that you just give kind of almost like, not an assignment, but you give this, like, blessing to go study, because I think there's so much out there that you will have plenty to do in that regard.
Totally.
Like, there's I will spend the rest of my life reading smart people I have never heard of at all. There's so much out there. So you've got plenty you can wrestle with and pray over and all that good stuff without, like, necessarily just telling your spouse tonight over dinner, like, I'm doing this and you can't stop me. So.
And to me, that's kind of the beauty of it, is that there really is, like, there's an inexhaustible library and richness of wisdom. That, man, back to your point earlier, I didn't understand how limited that library was in the church of my youth. It was very limited, and I didn't realize that. And now I'm like, oh my gosh, like, the gift of having a treasury of not just literature, but literature, music, art, prayers, all these things, like, just opened up to, like, learn and understand and use. And and really get to know. It's beautiful.
It is beautiful. And you feel like you've been given this inheritance into a family that's like bonkers. It's not talented isn't even the right word, but just like bonkers overflowing with gifts. And you get to be part of that family that you totally don't deserve, but it's a fantastic feast. And you just get to eat like the rest of your life, all this really amazing stuff. And it's, I agree. It just is. I think that's something I really appreciate as a convert that perhaps cradle Catholics forget is just like what the feast is and how beautiful and overwhelming it is. So that's really cool. Well, I definitely want to unpack more. I think maybe at some point we need to have Amber on because your story can't not be told without her, because I remember, her being like, nope, not going to be Catholic. That's for all these reasons. And then like, I felt like months later, she was like, I am 100% on board. I fully have jumped in the water and I'm not looking back. So I think it's worth telling. So,
yeah, I think, to put a button on it, I think pain can get you off high center. I think when you've experienced or endured a pain in a religious structure that you hoped would be the answer, it can get you off center. And
sure.
And I will say, and this is like, it bears saying in any of these conversations, like, hey, I get it. The Catholic Church has caused a lot of people pain.
Yeah.
And not just those who've been sexually abused. Like that's what comes to our mind when we talk about it. But it's created pain to, average lay people. It's created pain to indigenous people. Like these are not small things.
Right.
And yet where we are in this phase of life, like we've actually experienced a lot of healing in the journey.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. I love that. Yeah. We'll unpack more of that forever, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, probably.
Okay. Well, that's a great place to pause and ask you, Seth, what might be adding more beauty to your very hectic days right now?
Oh, this is an easy one. So we were with some friends on their farm, Jared and Lindy Phillips. They are fantastic human beings. Jared's a professor at the University of Arkansas. He's a writer. He's written a book called Hipbillies, which I think one needs to put down everything and go read it.
All right.
It's a book about the Back to Land movement in Arkansas and all these crazy California hippies who came out here and learned from, the hillbillies in Madison County or whatever.
Right.
So it's a great book. But they had a sorghum pressing out on their property where they took sorghum and they pressed it and boiled it down into molasses this weekend. At the end of the sorghum pressing, they had an old timer come out and teach us how to square dance, which I did not participate in because I neither dance nor am I square. I'm terrible. It's awful. I'm awful. You don't want to see me do it. But we were talking about poetry. Lindy and Jared and Amber and I were talking about poetry. And the next morning I woke up and Lindy had sent me a poem, which I will not read because I don't have permission to. But I just read her poetry. And I've read it several times since she sent it. And it's not famous. It's not well known. It's crafted from the hills of the Ozarks. I love it. And it is bringing so much goodness to my life right now.
I love that. I love that it's both poetry and it's local and you can't share it and no one can find it. That's cool.
Yeah, you can't. You literally can't find it unless you know Lindy's number and then you can call her and ask her for it.
Right. That's fantastic.
So
good one.
So Tish, what are you engaged in? What are you into right now that is bringing more goodness, truthfulness, or beauty to your own life?
Well, as you know, last weekend I was at the Catholic Imagination Conference, and along with it being a head explosion of information and super smart people and just, being in the same room with all sorts of people I wanted to meet, it was also a delight to be reunited with people I just really love. Mutual friends were there, Bond and her husband, whom we spent time in Italy with. And we also, I didn't tell you this, but we had brunch with Hope and Holly, and it was so fun.
I saw the photos.
I know. It was great. You were missed.
It was so good.
And then I missed out on getting to hang out with Rick and Stephanie, but Bond and Reese did. And it was just so fun to see these people. And my initial reaction was like, from all this just goodness, is to like sit down and write and get words down on paper and unpack all this smart stuff that, you know, I was taught, I guess, over the weekend. But instead, I made a playlist. It's like I needed a playlist of music to it was like I needed that to process the beauty of friendship and knowledge and the craft of writing, instead of like the utility of writing. So I created an autumn playlist, and I've been listening to that all week long. And it's just been really delightful. And it's nothing, I mean, it is amazing because I like all the songs on it, but it's just your classic folksy autumny music like Fleet Foxes and Hippocampus and Jose Gonzalez and Milk Carton Kids, but then also just some classics like Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald. And it's just been good. Like, it's been a good reminder to me that I'm more than a brain, you know?
And you're going to share that, right?
I am. I'll put it in the show notes. It's really good, if I say so myself.
Well, I'm sure that we'll all agree.
Yeah. So I will definitely share it for all who want to imbibe and pretend like it feels like autumn outside, even though it doesn't here in Texas. So,
do you know one of the best shows I've ever seen was the Milk Carton Kids?
Yeah, I've seen them in person too. So good. They're so good.
Just talented, funny, just the whole package. I'm a little bit jealous of them. I'm not going to lie. They're annoying how talented they are. But yeah, go see them if you can. All right, guys, it's time to wrap this chat up. You can find this episode as well as all episodes at adrinkwithafriend.com. And you can also go there to help support this show by picking up the next round of drinks. You can find me and how to connect with me, especially via my newsletter, at tishoxenrider.com. Seth, how about you? You can find me at sethhaines.substack.com.
All right. Music for the show is by Kevin MacLeod. Editing is by Kyle Oxenrider. I'm Tish Oxenrider with Seth Haines, and we'll be back here again with you soon. Thanks for listening.